Hi again, everybody. Welcome on in. My name is Ginny Svec. I'm a water resource specialist with the City of Phoenix. This class is designing a water harvesting landscape, and it is a part of our annual webinar series, Hydrate the Valley Phoenix, sponsored by the Phoenix Water Services Department. Kaylee Colter is here with us tonight. She's the founder of 88 Acres and will be our expert presenter on behalf of the Watershed Management Group. Tonight's presentation will be recorded and uploaded to the City of Phoenix YouTube channel and our Save Water website if you would like to share or reference it in the future. We will have a little bit of a pause in the middle for a quick break and answer some questions as well at that time. At about the 1 hour mark, we're going to have it at about 6:45-ish. And if you have any questions throughout the class, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll answer them, like I said, halfway through and then also at the end of class. You'll be able to type in the chat and can see others' questions and comments, so please keep in mind, we want to make sure we're going to be respectful in the chat and try not to distract from anybody else's learning. You can also privately chat us as well if you don't want everybody to see it. And again, you might have seen Laura here previously. She's not feeling super well tonight, so I am covering for her, but she should be back again next week for the next session. But yeah, with that, take it away, Kaylee.
Awesome. Thank you. Again, let's see. Let's make sure we're ready to go here. So yeah, my name is Kaylee Colter. I'm a landscape architect. I practice here in the Phoenix metro area. And I am here on behalf of Watershed Management Group. WMG is a nonprofit group that's started down in Tucson. And their kind of main focus is helping people learn skills for living a more sustainable livelihood. So a lot of that has to do with rainwater harvesting and some of the skills that we'll be learning about tonight. So like I mentioned, tonight our focus is going to be on water harvesting landscape design. What we're going to cover tonight, so we're going to start with kind of what are the water harvesting principles. So before you get into design, we're going to talk about the principles that kind of are going to set you up to create a rainwater harvesting landscape. The second is how to get started at your site. So we'll kind of get into the, like, once you've got a, a project in mind, where do you start? Where do you go from there? And then we'll talk about some of the specific techniques and skills that you can use in your specific project. All right. So, but before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit about why. Now, hopefully you guys are at least interested and curious about rainwater harvesting, but we're going to kind of go into, why we think that this is important. So the first thing I want to talk about is this kind of shift that has been happening, especially, in the Phoenix metro area, but across the country as well, is this increase in development. And so what happens when we, build more, right? And is that we actually create conditions to cause more runoff, and some knock-on side effects based on that. So if we look on the left, we see kind of a picture of a natural area that has not been developed, it hasn't been disturbed. And in that scenario, when we get rain, we get about 50% total of that rainfall that infiltrates into the soil, either shallow or deep infiltration. We get about 40% of that actually supports vegetation, and that vegetation does something called evapotranspire, which means that it actually puts moisture off into the environment. So that means about 40% of that water is getting used by plants and put into the atmosphere. And then what we have is only about 10% of that rainfall being runoff. And runoff is that water that collects on the surface and just does just that. It runs off, it runs away, and you're not able to really easily collect or use that water as a resource. So it doesn't stay in our immediate environment. The difference that starts to occur when we are developing is that we increase what are called impermeable surfaces. So these are surfaces that don't allow water to penetrate through them. And so when we do that, we kind of change the situation of what happens with rainfall. So we actually only end up getting about 15% of that rainfall infiltrating. And we also get less evapotranspiration, right? Because we're replacing plants and vegetation with buildings and elements of the built environment. So that number reduces. And then what we get an increase in is runoff. So we're up to 55% of runoff. So that's all water that used to stay in our environment, in our atmosphere, and is actually getting collected and runs off into other areas. It goes downstream and is not, used by us. And so, what we're trying to accomplish by designing these rainwater harvesting landscapes is to kind of even this out a little bit. We want to kind of make sure that even though we're in the built environment, we're trying to capitalize and make that rainfall available to us and use as much of it as possible and keep as much of it in our environment as possible, because that also helps us regulate the microclimate, make sure that the environment's not getting too hot. And so we can do this by just making sure that we thoughtfully design the landscapes that are within our built environment. So, as a reference and kind of a guidepost for this type of design, we like to reference the book by Brad Lancaster. So, Brad is actually a Tucson local, and his book is Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond. There's 2 volumes of this book. Volume 1 is the one that's probably most useful to most of you, and has it's just a really great resource. He has a lot of useful information. It's really easy to digest. It's not a hugely expensive book, so I really recommend it if you're able to get access to it. It's at most of the libraries in the valley as well. But we're going to kind of talk about the principles that he outlines in this book, and these help guide you on that design process. The first one is to begin with long and thoughtful observation. So it's really important whenever you're designing any kind of landscape to kind of live in that space and allow yourself to have that process of long and thoughtful observation. The reason this is beneficial is because, just kind of on the surface, right, you get to see the landscape. You give yourself time to think about ideas that you want to incorporate. But when you think about it, it's also really important to observe that landscape throughout all of the seasons of the year, right? Where shadows are going to fall is going to change throughout the year. Which areas are hot spots and which areas are not might change throughout the year. You'll also see maybe different patterns. Maybe you have some neighbors who are only there half the year, and the other half of the year they're not, and their barking dog goes with them, or just whatever. There's just tons of things that can occur throughout the year, and if you allow yourself to experience all of them, you can incorporate more of that information into your design. So if you kind of rush into the process and try and tackle everything all at once, you might miss out on the opportunity to address some of those potential challenges or take advantage of some of those opportunities. So once you've kind of completed your observation, you're taking your time. When we start with the design process, especially when we're talking about water harvesting, we want to start at the top. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So when we start at the top of the watershed or the top of the catchment area, we're starting at the highest elevation point. So in this example of the, residence, we would start at the roof, right? And the other reason for doing this is that it allows us to intervene, so to capture or collect that water when it has the least amount of potential energy associated with it. So before before it makes its way to the ground, when it's just hitting the roof, it hasn't had as much of a chance to pool together, to pick up velocity, to pick up speed. But as it continues to move, right, it's going to move down through the watershed. More pressure of gravity is going to be exerting over it. If you try to intervene by the time it gets to the street, that water might be moving kind of fast and it might have a lot of volume associated with it. But if we start higher in the watershed, we get to collect that water before it's had a chance to build up all that energy and that volume. So that's one benefit of it. The other benefit is the higher up in the watershed we act, the more able you are to use gravity to manipulate the movement of that water. So if we try to collect the water, on the surface here, it's really hard once it's there to get it to move places we want it to go. But if we start higher up, we have a lot more control over that. So there's two primary reasons, and both of it have to do with kind of making this process easier. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the term, I said a term there, watersheds. And a watershed is, it's actually, it can be a kind of, ambiguous isn't quite the right word, but the definition of watershed can really vary. So a watershed is any land area that drains to a particular point, or common point. And so a watershed can exist at many different scales. So if you look at the map at the right, we've got uh, a graphic of the state of Arizona, and you can see watersheds for the Verde River, for the Salt River, and the other rivers throughout the state. But uh, even if you break it down further, you can break it down further than that and make these into sub watersheds, or you could take a step out, and for example, the Salt River. Those rivers are actually part of the Colorado River watershed. So it just kind of depends on what scale you're looking at. And the reason that's important for us is because we can actually consider, your project area or your site as its own watershed. So for most of you, it's probably going to be your home and your yard. And we can actually define that as a watershed, so that the water that falls on that point drains to a particular area. Okay, so the next principle here is to start small and simple. So I kind of mentioned that, long, thoughtful observation portion, and that sometimes, you get really eager to tackle a project and fix everything all at once. And when you do that, you can take on, a lot more than you might be ready to take on. But also, if you've, taken everything on all at one time, um, like I said, you may have missed something without observing it, with enough time or something like that. And so one of the benefits of starting with small and simple strategies is that you can build up your project over time. Another side effect of that is that it's a little bit more cost effective, right? You can start with these small and simple strategies, and they're not going to cost as much. They won't be as labor intensive. And this might mean, not necessarily that you're doing small installations, but you're phasing your project, right? You're not going to do the front and the backyard at the same time. Maybe you just focus on one or the other. But in any case, you get to kind of test out your strategies, test out uh, these principles that you're working with, and learn from them. So if you do make mistakes, then you're at least able to learn from them and incorporate changes the next time you build a basin. And so it's just a way of reducing the kind of burden and stress on yourself and making sure that you set your project up for success. All right. So the next principle here is, oops, sorry. Turning things on off here. Okay, sorry about that. So the next principle here is to spread and infiltrate the flow of water. And so this one really kind of gets into the general principle of how we want to manage water once it does get into your landscape. And so the general principle with all of these design techniques that we're going to discuss is to spread and infiltrate the flow of water. What we want to encourage is for that water to spread its way through the landscape, right? Because we'd like to use that water as a resource for irrigation. So we do need to spread it out. But also when we spread it out, we decrease the velocity and we decrease the kind of potential of that water to cause damage like erosion. And we want that water to infiltrate. So we want it to move slowly enough that it actually makes its way into the soil and into the landscape. When we have runoff, we have a volume of water that is kind of tightly controlled and moving very quickly. And that's what causes the runoff. It's not able to kind of stay in the landscape and infiltrate. And so that's, we want to encourage the opposite of that. So this little graphic kind of helps with explain that. We start with, a singular flow of water into the site, and you can see it's a little bit, you'll see that it's actually like a little bit of um, a bigger flow, right? Because it's just one um, pool of water. Okay, and so then what we do is we make our first intervention, and this intervention here is a berm. The berm actually has some penetrations in it, so water can get through, but what it does do is kind of slow the water, stop it up behind that berm before it goes throughout the rest of the landscape. And so what you'll see is that it divides that one big flow into a couple different flows. So there we are spreading that water throughout the landscape. Then we can make some more interventions. So say we make some more berms. These ones are solid berms. So these berms are going to be meant to hold that water back and allow it to infiltrate. And so that's what happens in these ponds where those berms are, because they don't have penetrations, the water can build up and pool and then sink into the landscape. And then for all of those berms, we have an overflow. So once that water fills up that berm, then it flows down to the next one. But you can see we're still dealing with a small volume of water. So we're still, implementing techniques to allow that water to kind of retain a small volume. And now we can start to plant our vegetation. The vegetation's also going to add to that infiltration of water because the plants themselves are going to soak up water as well. And then we can kind of allow that process to continue and repeat. So this is all about those general principles of spreading and infiltrating. It doesn't have to look like this solution, but it does want to you do want to think about achieving that goal. All right. So you just heard me mention a term called overflow, and that leads into our fifth principle here. So always plan for an overflow route and manage overflow as a resource. So whenever we think about storm events, there's not really a way to calculate what the most extreme storm event possible would be. There's always the potential for an even larger or bigger storm event to happen. And so that means that we want to make sure that the features that we design um, have a backup plan should that feature fill up. So for example, if you have a basin, it fills up with water because we get a crazy, insane storm. We want to have somewhere for that excess water to go once that basin fills up. Because if we don't think about it ahead of time, it could back up into something like your pool or your home that you don't want it to. And so that's what the overflow is. It's making sure that once your basin or feature is filled up, that water has a place to go. And it's even better if you can make that place where that water goes beneficial to you. So the example here, there's a berm at the top of this landscape here, and you can see water collecting or impounding behind that berm. Once that little kind of basin area behind the berm fills up, it spills over, so into the overflow, this little swale here, that directs it downhill, and it fills up another little basin. They actually have a tree planted over there. Once that fills, it spills over the overflow, and around this berm and down, to the bottom. So in each case, the overflow actually adds water to another feature. And in that way, we get to make the most use of that water possible. The sixth one here is maximize living and organic ground cover. So one of the reasons to consider both mulch and living plants as part of your rainwater harvesting system is that they increase the potential of your feature to harvest rainwater. So it's not just something that adds aesthetic value, or habitat, things like that. It actually improves the function of your rainwater harvesting features. So, for example, that the very beginning, we talked about, how plants are responsible for absorbing some of that water that would otherwise be runoff. When we plant plants in our basins, we're doing the same thing. We're having plants be part of that resource for absorbing water and preventing the creation of runoff. And then organic matter as a ground cover. So you can see in this picture, there's an organic wood chip mulch in this basin. And so the mulch itself actually has the capacity to hold some water, right? The wood chips can absorb water. But they also function by helping prevent evaporation. So having the soil covered means that the water in the soil is not going to be accessible to evaporation as easily. And so having that mulch there can kind of serve multiple functions. And then as that mulch gets broken down and incorporated into the soil, it actually adds that organic matter into the soil. And the more organic matter that a soil has, the better potential it has to hold water in it. Because again, all those organic fragments, those pieces of organic matter, can kind of act like a sponge and hold some water. So the more organic matter in the soil, the more that soil can hold water as well. And this is a picture of that same basin with all of that vegetation grown in. So you can see they didn't start with, a ton in that first example, but you can see how much it's filled in. And as those plants fill in as well, they start to act like their own living mulch too. All right, and then the last one here, I've got actually, there's one more beyond this. Number 7 is stacking functions. If you're familiar with permaculture at all, you might be familiar with the term stacking functions. But the idea here is that we want to be really thoughtful about our landscape design choices so that they serve more than one purpose. So, for example, we might look at uh, this native tree here is an ironwood. And ironwoods are a great tree a great tree for providing shade. So that's a great feature, and it looks like that one there's getting watered by a rainwater harvesting basin. So that's great. It's serving that function of being the vegetation with our basin. But there's some other additional benefits of ironwoods that are really great. They're a nitrogen fixing tree, meaning that they can kind of help make nitrogen more available in the soil. So that's a really great reason to add that tree. And they're also a really important tree in terms of habitat. They produce an edible seed pod, and they provide nice protection and nesting locations for birds. So it's just one example, even in one tree, that we can, choose to plant a tree or, make a design decision, and it can do more than one thing. It doesn't just have to be, a pretty tree to look at. So we want to kind of extend that thinking as much as possible throughout the landscape. All right, and then this is the last one that I was thinking of. So number 8, continually reassess your system. This actually kind of ties back to that first one, the continual, to the long, thoughtful observation. That is a key part of a rainwater harvesting landscape, is that we're always, it's really functional. These landscapes are designed to perform service. And so they need to be monitored, they need to be checked on. We need to make sure that things are working. So it might mean that things aren't, and that's okay. So this is an example of um, a basin where the berm was blown out here during a large storm event. And that's okay. That's part of your observation is to go out and check on these things, try and, intervene when you can. But then you get the opportunity to learn from that. Hey, maybe there shouldn't have been so much rock in this soil, or, whatever the problem is. It gives you a chance to kind of assess and figure out what went wrong and then do something better the next time. And if you've also done those small and simple strategies, you've started with one basin, maybe you can take that lesson that you learned from the failure in the first basin and incorporate some changes into the second basin. So that at least all these principles are kind of working together so that you can be successful in the long run. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is where, and this is where are you going to implement these design techniques? For most of you, I'm assuming you're going to be working on residential properties. So we're going to kind of have that focus, but uh, no matter where you're working, you've got to kind of start with the design process. So, as I mentioned, we're going to start with long, thoughtful observation. And the first part of that is conducting what we call site analysis. So, you're going to collect different information about the site that you're working on. So, about whatever your project is. For most of you, that's going to be your property. So it's going to be bounded by your property lines, and we'll have your home and other features that are, on your property. And we're going to kind of go through some different elements or different data that you're going to want to collect and put together for your site. So the first starting point is to draw your site and create a base plan. The base plan is kind of the basic just footprint that allows you to layer all this other information on top of it. So it's really the kind of basic outline of your site. As I mentioned, for most of you, the boundary of that site is probably going to be your property line. If you are unfamiliar with what your property line is, you can look that information up on the county assessor's website. So that's a really helpful resource. So you'll start with your property lines, and then you'll want to add your house, of course, or any other permanent structures. So that could be, a pool, a storage shed, guest house, separate garage, things like that. Anything that, is going to stay on your site. You would probably want to incorporate existing plants, especially if you're planning to keep those plants. So if you're, not planning to get rid of them, you definitely want to maintain those on your site plan. And then it's really important for what we're going to be doing the rest of the way here is marking the orientation. So you want to know where your north, south, east, west is. This will be really important when we talk about sun exposure and things like that. And it'll be important for your plant selection as well. Okay, so then once you have that base of the site plan, we want to kind of start layering on different information on top of that plan. And so we would look at, this is another permaculture term, but sectors or factors. These are different energies or characteristics or factors in the natural world that will interact with your site. So that, sounds kind of complicated, but what we're talking about are, sun exposure, water, how does that interact with your site, wind, fire, all these different things that may impact or at least just interact with your site. The first one we'll talk about are utilities. Utilities are really important in terms of setting up your base plan because not only do you want to be safe while you're implementing your design and not dig up or hit one of these lines unintentionally, but you don't want to set up your design so that your design, if you plant trees or things like that, that they create a conflict down the road either. Luckily, one of the resources that you can use to identify utilities is Arizona 811. This used to be Arizona Blue Stake. And they will come. This is a service that is free, and it is required for you to call 811 anytime you're going to be digging in your yard. And what the service provides is they coordinate with all of the local utilities. They'll identify which utilities may have lines or utilities or equipment on your property. And they will request that those utilities come out to your property and mark them so that you know where they are. One of the caveats of Arizona 811 is that they only mark public utilities. So they only will mark those lines that serve multiple people in the public. They will not mark private lines. So for example, they will mark the water line as it runs down your street and where up until it connects to your meter. And then once it connects to your meter, you have a private line that runs from the meter to service your house. They will not mark that line that runs from the meter to your house. So for those things, it's important for you to either have some knowledge of where those lines run, or be willing to hire a private locator who can locate those utilities for you. When they do come out and mark utilities, this little code is kind of helpful. They'll mark them in these colors. So you know if you see a blue line, it's potable water. Orange line would be communications, et cetera, et cetera. But you want to gain some knowledge of that too. So you can call Arizona 811 as early on in your design process as you want. They'll come out and mark it, and then you can translate those markings onto your plan. So in this case, you can see they've marked the blue line for the water service. They've got some sewer and cable and communications back in the backyard. Okay, the next one we want to talk about is sun, because this is one of the ever-present forces in our life here. When I do this presentation, I like to ask this trick question. It's a little bit harder in the uh, virtual format. But one of the things I like to point out that is that we all know that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. But there's a trick to that in that it only actually rises that true east and true west, or rises true east and sets true west 2 days of the year. And those are the equinoxes. And then between that, because of the angle of the sun, uh, the angle of the sun changes throughout the year. So this varies based on the latitude of the location you're in here in Phoenix or kind of central Arizona in general. This is the guidance for those sun angles. So you'll notice that in the winter, the sun rises and sets south of true east-west. So you'll see that it's starting not quite southeast and not quite southwest. And the other change that occurs is the angle of the sun. So at its apex, at its highest point in the sky in the winter, it only gets to about 33 degrees. And so what this means for us in the winter is that we tend to have very long shadows in the winter as compared to in the summer. So that's an important thing to notice. The other thing is that when we have that afternoon sun in the winter, it doesn't get all the way to true west. So if you're kind of planning around that sun in the afternoon, just know that it's not going to get all the way to the west mark. And then in the summer, we have a little bit of a difference, right? And so that sun is rising and setting north of true east and west. So you actually see it rising here. And then the other thing that will happen is that it's going to set in the afternoon north of true west. And one of the reasons this is important is because the sun in the afternoon is one of the worst exposures for us here, because the sun's been up all day and heating surfaces, and then because of the angle of the sun in the cutting through the atmosphere in the afternoon. And so it's really important, if we want to protect from that western exposure, that we're actually trying to protect it more north than we think we should. So that's an important thing to know. And then the other thing here is that the angle of the sun is higher at 78 degrees in the summer. And so that means the length of the shadows in the summer is going to be shorter. It also means that plants that maybe weren't getting a ton of sun or exposure during the winter are now going to be exposed to it in the summer. And so it's just something to think about when you're selecting plant locations. So an example of how this becomes important is planning for a vegetable garden. Vegetable gardens have a really high need for sun throughout the day, but they're also generally very sensitive to that sun in the afternoon. And so when you're doing your long, thoughtful observation, it can be really helpful to kind of pay attention to where the sun moves throughout the year. So this is a picture of the backyard of this home at 9 a.m. and this is the winter solstice. So this is when the winter sun hits its most extreme position. So you'll see that they're getting some ambient light. You can kind of see the angle of the sun coming in from the south here. I should say that the picture that I'm showing you here of this backyard is south facing. And then there's a picture here at 1 p.m. So in the kind of middle of the afternoon, when the sun should be at its highest point. And you can see that they kind of carefully planned this garden. This line here of dark shade is from their block wall. So there's a block wall along the back here. So before they designed this garden, they actually paid attention to where that um, shadow falls in the winter, so that even in the winter, that garden is getting sun in the afternoon. And then you can see at 5 p.m. when the sun's going down, they've got that garden so that it's getting shade and it's protected from that western afternoon sun. So this is just a good example that, it's especially for vegetable gardens, it's really important to be paying attention to that exposure. Some plants are a little bit more tolerant, but for gardens, it's really important. Okay, so here's an example of how you could add that information to your site plan. You can see we've got the sun locations where it's rising and setting marked here. And he's got winter and summer identified for those. And then just also marking, like, maybe you may want to mark any locations that are particularly hot, or anywhere where you really want shade. It's really flexible. It's up to you. But what you want to kind of do is identify all of the, sun related issues. Okay, so the next one is water, because we all have, at some point, we have some waterfall on our property. So we talked about watershed, right? So you want to identify the watersheds within your site and identify where everything on your property is draining to. So even though you've got a roof, even if you have a flat roof, that roof is going to drain to different places in your yard. If you have a roof with angles on it, then you'll have pitches to that roof and you'll have to kind of figure out which direction the water is flowing based on the angles of that roof. And then kind of paying attention to your site and seeing where water flows once it falls on the ground. One of the most practical ways for you to do that is to wait for a storm event to occur, right? Do that long, thoughtful observation and observe during a rain event where all the water is draining to. If you have any areas that have low points or high points, if you have areas where water constantly pools and never dries, those are all things you would probably want to mark on this plan, and maybe, try to address with your design. You can also add information like hose bibs and any places where you have irrigation already hooked up. Um, and or any other interesting or important water features or not water features but any features of your landscape that affect how water moves. Okay. And then what we do is we conglomerate all of that information together. So it's really great to be able to layer this information on top of each other because you can kind of see certain patterns that emerge. If you've got, so for example, they've got a lot of sun exposure on this western side here, but they have a tree in place. So that tree is probably there because of that reason, but it leaves a couple of hot spots exposed. So maybe they want to add a tree there. You can add, all kinds of information to this plan if you'd like. If you notice wind patterns, you could add those. If you have, like they've written neighbor here. So maybe that neighbor is something that they want to screen from or for some reason. So whatever information is relevant to you, you're the one who's in charge. So you get to be the one who decides what information to put here. But it's all meant to help you kind of create that site plan so that when you create your design, you're not starting from a blank slate. You have some information to guide you. Okay. That might be a good place if we want to take a pause and answer questions.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. So I hope that you all have been learning a lot. I know I have as well. I don't think that we had any questions really come in. There were just some. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to pop those in the chat now. Cassie said that when planning or drawing the site for their house, they found Google Maps to be really helpful for that. Which, yeah, that totally makes sense. And that's all I'm seeing right now. If anybody else has another question, feel free to put it in. We can always answer it at the end of the meeting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add a little bit to that. So Google Maps can be really great. It does have a lot of aerial imagery. If you have access to Google Earth, that's an even better resource. So Google Earth is a program, you have to download it, but it is free. And the reason that it's beneficial is that you can print maps more easily. So if you're just accessing Google's resources through their website, you're it's not as flexible for creating a base map, but Google Earth is really flexible. Also, if you are, able to access the assessor's website, it's a really good resource as well. I mean, you can print maps, and they conduct their aerial photography every year now. So you can get really, recently updated aerial images, whereas the Google images, don't get done as frequently. So if you can kind of if you have a background in GIS or you're willing to kind of try and figure out the assessor's website, that's the one that I really like to recommend.
Yeah, great points. And yeah, I've used that as well. It's great. It's also free. Everybody can use it. I'll try to send that in the chat in a little while. There's one person that just asked, they have a couple of areas that have a lot of shade in the morning and then intense midday and afternoon sun. How can they add plants with that in mind?
Can you say that one more time for me?
For sure. This person has a couple of areas that have a lot of shade in the morning and then intense midday and afternoon sun. How can they add plants with that in mind?
Yeah, I would try to plan for the sun because it's going to be the most restrictive. Um, and if that, exposure in the afternoon, uh, in midday and afternoon is extreme, then you might want to look at, plants that are really tough and hardy or plants that are going to tolerate a reflected sun exposure. So things like creosote, brittle bush, they're going to be really tough. And I guess the other thing I would ask too is if that exposure is happening all year round as well, because sometimes if you plan for that kind of exposure and it's happening in the winter and then in the summer it gets more direct sun. If you plant something that's shade tolerant instead of planting something that is like sun hardy, when the pattern changes throughout the year, then those plants can really struggle. So I would say try to plan for the more limiting condition, which would be the extreme sun.
Thank you. And then there was someone else that asked, Dave asked, what alternatives to professional surveyors can I use for topography?
Okay, so that's a great question because for most people, a surveyor would be cost prohibitive for topography. Um, so one thing is site observation, right? So especially during a rainfall event when, rain is actually actively falling, you can use that to kind of get a sense of how water is moving. And because water is only going to move with the path of least resistance, following gravity, you can see where high spots and low spots are in your yard. But if you'd like to be more precise about the topography, um, there is an old-fashioned tool or like a low-tech tool you can use. Um, I've more often heard it called a bunyip, but I'm sure there's other names for it. And essentially, what you're doing is taking advantage of the concept that water in a closed container always finds a level. And so what it is you basically take a length of hose, and then you send that hose on either side up a length of a yardstick or 2x4 or some extra wood. And you make sure that that hose stays open on either side. And then what you do is fill the hose with water, and then what you can do is set each end of that hose at different points in the yard, and you can measure the difference between those two elevations because the water is going to always find level. And then if you have the if you have some inch markings marked out on those yardsticks or wooden posts, you can tell the difference. You can calculate the difference between the 2 points. So it takes a little bit of work because you have to kind of do that in a systematic way, make a grid or something like that. But it's probably one of the most low tech ways to do it. And
Very
I
cool.
will, yeah, the other thing too is I think that in Brad Lancaster's book, he has some guidance in one of the appendix sections about how to make and use a bunyip. So if you need more instructions, I'd look there.
Awesome. And Dave said thanks for the bunyip tip, which was kind of funny. So, uh, um, Jewel said, I think in response to the previous person asking about the sun situation in their yard, that they can plant shade, or I suppose use shade or build shade structures to protect delicate plants. So that's definitely, I think, something you could do as well. And then yeah, Susan, someone asked about the not seeing other people's questions. I think some of them are asking them privately, so you might only see ones that are asked to everybody. But I think that's all of the questions I'm seeing for now. So I suppose we could take about a 5-minute break or so, if that sounds good,
Sure.
and return at 6:57. Yeah, all
Sounds
right.
good.
See you all in a second. All right, well, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully, you're making your way back to the webinar. Um, and yeah, I'll take it away again, Kaylee. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. So we talked about getting started and working with your site plan, and now what we'll get into are what do these techniques look like? I'm talking about rainwater harvesting landscapes. So what are we actually talking about here? So let's make sure we're ready to go. Okay. So more specifically, what we're going to talk about tonight are passive rainwater harvesting strategies. If you've ever heard of rainwater harvesting, the first thing you think of might be like a rain tank or a rain cistern. And that is definitely an aspect of rainwater harvesting, but we actually have two main categories of rainwater harvesting that we like to refer to in the profession. And so the first one is passive. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Active rainwater harvesting is a strategy or type of rainwater harvesting that involves more active, more technology. So that's when we start talking about tanks, cisterns, things like that. Passive rainwater harvesting, on the other hand, is primarily utilizing earthworks to harvest the water. And so the main strategies here involve using gravity to move water through the landscape. Some other characteristics of passive rainwater harvesting projects include that the water is not stored. So you're not storing the water and using it at a later time. You're infiltrating the water into the soil. And so that means that your soil becomes essentially your rain tank. And so the more water that your soil can hold, the more water that you're going to be harvesting in your landscape. These features tend to be less expensive as well because you're utilizing materials that are on site already. The one downside can be that, especially if you're trying to do the work yourself, that can be a little bit more labor intensive because moving soil and dirt can be a lot of work. So um, I just want to make sure. Can everybody see my screen? It's telling me that I pause. What did I pause? Nope.
We're just seeing the question how right now.
Yeah.
Apologies.
Okay, that's what I thought. There we go. Okay. I'm glad I caught that. Okay. I think we're good now.
Yeah, we can see the earthworks
Okay,
slide.
great.
Okay.
Okay, cool. All right. So yes, we're using gravity to so those techniques we talked about, spreading and infiltrating the water, we're using gravity primarily as our tool for doing this. Um, Also, we talked about that starting small and simple. Passive rainwater harvesting is part of that strategy. These are the simplest, easiest techniques to implement. And so if you start with them, you can kind of get your feet wet, learn a little bit how it works before you move on to more resource intensive projects. Uh, and then the other thing I like to mention here is it's not really a kind of one or the other situation where you either do passive harvesting or active harvesting. Passive systems really are the foundation for active systems. So really you want to start with your passive system first, and then potentially add on active systems later. I mean, there are some situations, some caveats to that, of course, but you always want to try and have uh, your earthworks set the foundation for any active rainwater harvesting that you do. Okay, so there's tons of different actual structures and techniques for uh, rainwater harvesting features. We'll talk about some of the ones that are really prominent or really common to see. But this resource, this is from the city of Tucson. They have a water harvesting guidance manual. And these are just, a selection of ideas, including things like berms and basins. They actually even have French drains here, different types of spillways and swales. So all different types of strategies. We're going to talk about the main ones tonight and talk about them based on what they do. So the first one or the first, set of features would be swales. Swales, for lack of a better term, are ditches. It's like a small, shallow ditch. So it's just meant to convey water. So you use a swale when you want to get water from one place to another. And You can also use a swale, especially because they're so kind of narrow. In really narrow spaces like these are all examples of landscape medians, between a street and a sidewalk. And so swales work really well in those kind of situations as well. And Like we talked about, having living uh, plants as part of this system. We want to see our swales planted. Sometimes you'll hear them called bioswales because of that. These swales are a little bit different than a basin in that water. The main part of the feature isn't so that water collects there and then infiltrates, but we do want to design the swale so that water can slow down as much as possible. And so you'll see some of those techniques used here. In the center picture, you can see that this swale is very windy. That makes it so the water really has to move through and, kind of take turns and things like that. That not only helps to slow the water down, but it helps water get caught and collected in between, behind little nooks and crannies. And so that's one way to help slow the water down. And then you'll see in the one on the furthest on the right, they're using rocks and riprap to help with that. So behind this boulder here, there's a line of riprap, which is rock with a larger diameter. And so even though water can still move over that, when it hits that riprap, it will allow some water, because there's larger gaps in between those rocks, it'll allow some water to sit there and pond. And so that just gives you a little bit, or, just enough of a slowdown of that water so that you can increase infiltration within that swale. This is another example of a swale. This is kind of like the lowest tech version of that possible. I mean, if you just kind of looked at this area without the water, being able to see the water, you might not even notice that that swale is there. And so that's the intention with these features. They don't have to be super, some of the ones in this previous picture are very deep, very, easy to tell that they're there. But really all it has to do is convey water, and you don't have to have a huge steep slope in order to be able to do that. Okay, the next feature that you'll probably see most of the time are basins, water harvesting basins. Basin, for lack of a better term, is a hole in the ground. So basin is dug out and from finished grade. So you'll see it sink down into the landscape, like you can see in these two images. The intention or the point of having a basin is to allow water to infiltrate. So whereas with a swale, we're kind of moving water from one place to another, with a basin, what we're trying to do is get that water to stay in one place so it infiltrates and sinks down into the soil. So that's that, sink part of that, spread and sink water. Uh, the other thing with the basins this gives you a lot of opportunity for incorporating plants and organic matter, and especially because water is going to be sitting, in these basins. We really want to make sure that it's infiltrating as quickly as possible. We want that water to infiltrate within 36 hours. We don't want to, beyond that, we kind of increase the risk of breeding mosquitoes and other vector problems. So we want to make sure that water absorbs as quickly as possible. So having the organic matter and the plants in these basins is really helpful for that. All right, so I've got a couple of examples to show throughout this, kind of peppered throughout. So this is a residential project, like many of you are probably going to be working with. You can see they've already called out blue stake, and they have marked some power utilities. And you can also see where they've marked on the sidewalk, you can see the blue line there. That's for their water service. And you might be able to make out the box for their meter. So you can see that they've only marked that line, that service line right up to their meter. And so from there, they would have to either know where it goes or hire a private locator. But you can see that they've just kind of started with a little bit of a blank slate there. This was a volunteer workshop day, so there was a lot of people come out to assist with this. They've excavated some shallow basins. So even though these are basins, they can hold quite a bit of water. You can see that they're not super deep. So these aren't, it's, not like digging a pool, but they can be really subtle and depending on how they're designed, they can be dug out by hand. You don't necessarily need equipment to excavate these for you. So that's kind of those basins in progress. And then here's their finished product. They elected to use organic mulch, so wood chip mulch throughout the entire front yard. So that's what this darker color brown is here. And then you can see they used a different material. It's still a wood chip material, but a different material for a pathway. So that's a great way to kind of still use organic mulch, but kind of have some uh, uh, ways to differentiate it and create, a feature in the landscape. And then they've got both of these large basins in the front yard planted with mostly native or desert adapted plants here. And so that's going to give them a great starting point for organic matter and living mulch and living plants within their basins. You can also see it's a little bit hard to tell, but you can kind of just make out. Remember, we talked about those flags they had in the yard for the power utilities. So they've designed their basins to be just outside of those, so they don't start actually sloping down the basement until they get outside of that zone. And that's just to help, like we mentioned earlier, prevent any potential damage to those utilities either during construction or from the plants later on. Okay. So that was a kind of in-project example of some basins. This is an example of another feature that's common to see, which is a berm. A berm is a raised feature, kind of similar to a dam that holds back water. And different from a basin, a berm is built on top of existing soil. So on top of whatever the finished grade is, the berm goes on top as opposed to a basin, which gets excavated out from the soil. However, you'll often see these two features combined. So you might see what's called a berm and basin. And so you can kind of see it in this little graphic here, but you can dig out an area for your basin and then take that soil and turn it over and use it to build the berm. And then that way you get to kind of double duty, right? You get to excavate a little bit of soil and then add it to your berm. So there's a little bit less digging and the soil that you dig out goes somewhere. And so you'll often see those two features combined. So in this example, how this one works here, this is the primary berm. There's a gutter, you can see just barely on the corner of the house there that runs down this wall and behind this low site wall. Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I have a better. There we go. I was like, I know I have the progression. So yeah, that water comes from the gutters through the downspout and runs along a swale. So you can see that little bit of the swale here, and then into this first um, basin, berm and basin, right? So this is the berm portion, and then the basin behind it. Once this basin fills up, it does have an overflow. So it'll fill up and it'll overflow around the side here and go into this swale. This swale is lined with rock. This is probably just a design decision and based on what material that they had available. Because the swale up north here is covered with wood chip mulch. At any rate, there's an overflow. It overflows around the side, goes through the swale, and there's actually another small little basin at the bottom of the hill. And so this one is a great example of making sure that that overflow goes somewhere and that you use that overflow as a resource. The other, and I think this is another example of when berms are really useful is when there's a lot of elevation change in the landscape. So if you have a yard that has a lot of slope to it, berms can be really useful because they can kind of help you terrace the landscape and make use of it. Because when there's a lot of a steep slope to it, it can be hard to incorporate basins. So these berm solutions might be a little bit better fit. Another option you might see would be French drain. And so French drains aren't my favorite feature to recommend. They're really good for infiltration, so similar to basins. But they're better suited for areas where you have either a very narrow space to work with, or if you have a lot of hardscape. Because if you need to bust up the hardscape in order to implement some kind of feature, you likely aren't going to want to break up more concrete than you need to, and so like a narrow French drain might be useful. So a French drain involves digging a trench. So you kind of dig a narrow shape, but it's deep. And then you fill that trench with rock and usually a perforated pipe that allows water to be directed from your downspout or wherever you're collecting it from into that trench. And so you basically are kind of creating like a pool or something like that that can hold a larger amount of water because it's got extra pore space in between all those rocks. The challenge or downside with the French drains is that inevitably sediment gets into that French drain and starts to fill up the pore space, so it does become less effective over time. So that's something you have to, kind of keep an eye on. There are some best practices. I think I've got some pictures here. Yeah. So some best practices to kind of, increase the longevity of that French drain. The first is to use landscape fabric. So you should always line that French drain with landscape fabric to prevent as much sediment from getting in there as possible. The other thing that you can do is use something like it's kind of like a surge tank here. So you can see this one's pretty low tech. It's actually built out of a 5-gallon bucket, but they have the water that's going into the French drain directed into this bucket first. And that allows the water to fill up the bucket. And then once it fills, then it overflows into the French drain. And so this allows sediment that's in that water to kind of settle at the bottom of that tank or the bottom of that bucket instead of getting pushed directly into the French drain. So if you have the ability based on how that French drain is working, you can set up something like this. That way you will have to periodically clean out the 5-gallon bucket or the surge tank. But it should keep your actual French drain clear of sediment for much longer. All right, so if we're going to put this all together, this is kind of an example of how all these features might be integrated. So you've got the home here, right? We're starting at the top of the watershed, trying to collect that water as far up as possible. And they've got a downspout that lets out into the landscape. In this example, they're using a swale that's conveying the water from that downspout into a large basin. They've used some additional features here, like a rock armored spillway. Basically, this is just a small berm that allows the water to kind of be divided. So remember, we talked earlier on about splitting up that flow so it's not just one big stream. We're breaking it up into 4 smaller flows. And they're using rock to do this because the more velocity water has, the more likely it is to create erosion. And one way to prevent that is to use rock. Rock is a really great resource for stabilizing soils. So anywhere in your rainwater harvesting landscape that you might have an increased velocity of the water, you can use rock or riprap to help stabilize the soil and reduce erosion. All right, and then that water is directed into a mulched basin. Uh, this, in their graphic here, you can see they're just using native soil, so there's no need to kind of amend the soil or, change what the soil is. Uh, they've just added mulch on top, and that mulch will also break down over time and get incorporated into the soil, so it will increase the water holding capacity of that soil over time. And then they've got a lot of, so the mulch is part of their organic material, but you can see they've also added a lot of plants to this basin. So they've got a lot of grasses here, and grasses are really great, especially to add anywhere, again, like you have a spillway or where the velocity is a little bit high. Grasses are really great because they have very fibrous root systems, so they kind of help hold soil in place a little bit better. So you can see they've added a lot of those in there. And they've actually got their tree planted here on a planting terrace. And this is something that's kind of optional, but especially if you have a lot of mulch in your basin. Last week we talked about, having mulch in your basins and being careful that the mulch isn't building up around the base of the trunk of your tree, because that can create a lot of health problems for the tree. So one thing that you can do if you want to have a mulch in the basin and not have that problem is to plant your trees on a terrace. And so that can kind of be just a little bit of a raised area. And as long as the tree's canopy overlaps the basin, that tree is going to be getting water from the basin. So you don't have to worry that, by putting it up here, it's not going to be able to get any of that water. It definitely will. This just prevents mulch and moisture from building up around the trunk of the tree. Okay, so here's a kind of real life example of a project like that. So you can see they've got a gutter on their roof here, and they're sending water through the downspout. One thing I'll mention too, since I'm talking about gutters, is that especially if you're working with a passive rainwater harvesting project, gutters aren't absolutely necessary. So if you find them to be, kind of an expense, a little too expensive, or just not an option right now, um, they're not absolutely necessary. In this specific, circumstance, it kind of makes sense because they have a pathway going to their front door. And if that water was just coming off of the roof here, it obviously you could, create water ponding and dripping, as people are walking on this sidewalk. But it would also make it difficult to collect in this specific circumstance. It'd be difficult to collect the water because of the pathway and the existing shrubs here. So the gutter makes sense. But if you just had an open landscape area, instead of using a gutter, you could just slope that landscape towards your basin. And then that way you wouldn't have to necessarily install a gutter. So, the examples I'm showing you have them. And they're definitely convenient because you can be very precise with where you're, putting that water. Like I said, you're starting at the top of the watershed and kind of directing that water as early on as possible. But yeah, if you don't have the option to, you can definitely go without gutters. So in this case, they've got a downspout, and then right under their downspout, they have lined that area with rock. That's a great choice because, like I said, we're kind of collecting that water and forcing it into a pipe. And that pipe, it's going to have kind of a little, it's going to pick up some velocity and speed. and volume. So when it comes out here, it could create a lot of erosion. So having the riprap there kind of helps prevent that. And then all of that water is directed into this basin here. So you can see this first basin. They've got some wood chip mulch in the bottom of the basin covering that soil, and some native plants as well. It's a little bit hard to see because there's a hot bush here in front of it, but they have a spillway so that once this basin fills, it overflows into a second basin. So another great example of, making sure you've got an overflow and then the overflow is being used for something as well. The other thing I like about this landscape design is that they've taken a lot of the soil they excavated for the basins and used it to make these pathways. So you can see they kind of have a little bit of a raised pathway to the left of their basins. And so that way they're taking that soil that they've excavated, and instead of having to kind of dispose of it, they're using it on site for another purpose. Okay. So if you're interested in implementing some earthworks into your landscape, it is important to know that there is some basic math that is associated with it. We won't get too much into it because you guys are all volunteering to be here, so I won't force you to do math. But I do want to just make sure that you know that there's some equations out there that can help you calculate these things if you get further into your design process. So if you are designing earthworks, there's a couple of different methods that you can use for sizing those features. And the reason we want to size them is because we want to know, or at least get as close as possible to knowing how much water those features can hold. And then that way you know what would be considered overflow and when you need to have that overflow go to the next feature. So there's a couple of ways to do that. One is to kind of use the stormwater retention method. This is the same method used by civil engineers, and basically you're calculating the size of the feature based on the size of the storm event that you want to capture. And storm events are categorized by 25, well, they're smaller increments than this, but 25, 50 year, 25 year, 50 year, 100-year storm events. So, and these are associated with the probability of that size storm event occurring. And the sorry, the thing that I was going to, what was I going to say here about the stormwater retention? So you have to determine which size storm event you're going to use. If you were a civil engineer and you were calculating this, then a municipality would tell you you need to collect the rain from a 2-hour, 100-year storm event. But you as a homeowner, you get to kind of determine this for yourself. So what I like to do is kind of figure out what is kind of the most common size storm event for your region or as close to you as possible, and size it based on that. So that way you know that you're going to be able to capture the amount of rain that would fall, maybe 80 or 90% of the time. So that's the stormwater retention method. The second method is the percolation rate method. And so this is a method that you would use to size your basins based on how quickly the water will infiltrate through your soil. This method is probably most important if you know you have soil drainage issues, or if you're using gray water, but we're not talking about gray water tonight. So if you have soil that you know you have caliche, or say you have drainage problems, like say you have a spot in your yard and if it rains and it takes more than 36 hours for that water to infiltrate, then what I would say is that's when you should do the percolation rate. You should at least do the percolation test. And if you do have soil drainage problems, then I would use this percolation rate method. And then the third option is to actually size your basins based on how much water your plants will need. So you can kind of reverse engineer it, figure out, what plants you want to plant, and then figure out how much water you would need to provide to support those plants. Um, Typically, what I like to do is kind of start with the stormwater retention. So I'll design for a certain size storm event, typically a 1-inch storm event, figure out how big that makes the basin, and then see, how that compares with my landscape plan. And then either it's right on, or I might need to adjust how many plants I have or adjust how big my basin is. And so you can kind of do this iterative process where you figure that out, as you go. So this is some information that you'll need to know if you're going to do the first method here, the stormwater retention method. Um, the first thing I want you guys to look at here is as actually the equation here, potential harvested rainwater volume in gallons. So this is how you would calculate the uh, rainfall, the amount of water that you could collect on a surface. And so that equation is your catchment area in square feet. So for most of you, that's going to be your roof. So your roof area in square feet times the rainfall depth in inches. So how deep of a storm event are you talking about here? You multiply that by a constant, which is 0.623. This allows you to convert this number into gallons. And then you multiply that by a runoff coefficient. The runoff coefficient is a value that you select from the chart above here. And basically what this coefficient is saying is it's estimating how much water is lost on the surface that you're collecting the water from. So if you're collecting water from your roof, how much of that water is absorbed by the roof and how much of it do you get to collect? And so this value ranges from 0 to 1. The closer it is to 1, the more water you're collecting. And so you can see for a roof that ranges 0.8 to 0.95. It's a very high value for this coefficient because it's a solid surface. You're most likely going to collect most of that water. The differentiation here is based on the material of the roof. So, a metal roof being the highest coefficient number, and then asphalt shingles and things like that being lower numbers. So you have to select that, and you have to have a chart to help you select that. So you guys can use this one here. It can also be found in Brad Lancaster's book.
Hey, Kaylee, I think that your mic might have turned off. Just for this slide and like a tiny bit of the last slide. Yeah, I was gonna say maybe we could try without the headphones. We still can't hear you right this second though. If you go to audio options, it should like down by your microphone. Like on the screen, sorry. If you go down to your microphone on the screen and then you hit audio options, there should be an option to choose like where it's coming from. Okay. Hmm. So maybe you don't have that option. Let's see. I'm gonna try muting and unmuting you. Not a whole lot I can do from this side of things. Okay, you're unmuted. Still can't hear you. Sorry, everybody. Yeah, maybe we'll have you leave and rejoin. Someone wrote that. Oh no. It's okay. We'll get it.
Okay, I think,
Oh, oh, we got
yeah,
it.
yeah, okay, there we
Yay.
go. Sorry,
Okay.
I am not a WebEx pro, so
No,
that was the
you're fine.
problem there.
We rarely use it either, so yeah, troubleshooting is
Okay.
difficult. Thank you for your patience, everybody, and
Yes,
no worries at all.
yeah, I
It
really appreciate
happens.
it. Yeah. Okay,
It's just for the fun, you know.
yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah. Keep you guys on your toes. Okay.
exactly. All right.
Okay.
Wherever you're looking.
So let's see. All right. So let's go back
Oh,
to
and
our equation.
the presentation's not on.
Oh, I gotta go back to sharing.
I'll let
Okay.
you know when it's all good. Perfect.
Okay, cool.
Awesome.
Okay. All right. So we were talking about this, holy grail equation. This is the one you need if you want to calculate how much water you can collect from your roof. So we've got the catchment area in square feet times the rainfall depth in inches times the conversion factor times the runoff coefficient. And that will give you the volume in gallons. It's really important that you are reporting the rainfall depth in inches if you want this equation to work correctly. So if we go back to that example home that we had from earlier on, let's just say we want to calculate a small section of that roof. So what I generally do and so this is kind of a personal preference, but when I would start calculating, I always start with 1 inch rain event because for us in the Phoenix metro area, 1 inch is kind of like the most average large storm event. Beyond, storm events beyond 1 inch are relatively uncommon. So I always start with a 1 inch storm event. And then I'm going to multiply that by the square footage of that roof. And so that's 945 square feet because that's the area of roof that I want to calculate for. I've got my conversion factor, the 0.623. And because this is an asphalt shingle roof, I selected the 0.9 runoff coefficient. So it's about 530 gallons from that section of roof during a 1 inch storm event. So once you know how much water that is, then you might say, well, then how do I figure out how big this basin needs to be? And so what I like to do is kind of reverse engineer that. And then you can figure out the kind of estimated size for that basin based on that. So you use the same equation, but instead we're calculating for the area. I'm going to give it a depth. I always start with my basins at 10 inches, 10 inches deep, and then if I need to adjust it, I adjust from there. So I'll start with a 10-inch deep basin. What I'm solving for is the area. So how big of an area does this basin need to be? I'll use the same coefficient, conversion factor here. And I'm going to use the same runoff coefficient. And I know that I'm going to have 530 gallons that I'm trying to collect. So if I do the math and reverse that out, that gives me an area of about 100 square feet. So that basin needs to be about 100 square feet. So that means I need about a 10 by 10 basin. And then from there, I can decide, do I have room for a 10 by 10 basin? Is that insane? How will that work? And if so, then I can either, adjust the dimensions of the basin so that I still get 100 square feet, or I could change the depth of the basin, make it deeper so I can hold more water in it. There's a couple of options, but this is kind of how I always start the process. Okay, So one more example here for you guys. This is an example of a landscape with some existing plant material. You can see that ocotillo was still there from the original photo, and they've done their grading around that ocotillo. So if you have existing plant material that you want to protect, what I recommend is that you just design your features to be outside of the canopy drip line. So if you draw an invisible line from the edge of the um, canopy of that plant down to the soil, then just stay out of that area for excavation, and that should really help in terms of the design to keep those plants healthy. So you can see how this one works. They've got a swale that's running from their catchment area from their downspout into this kind of long linear infiltration basin. So it's a really nice, simple design. It's just got a swale and a basin, but it's capturing that water and delivering it to a bunch of different plants in the yard. Just some things to keep in mind in terms of locating earthworks. We do want to keep a safe distance from the home, especially from your foundation. So I like to keep those features minimum of 5 to 10 feet away from your home or from a foundation. Um, Utility lines, this does depend a little bit on the type of utility. But just know that if you're looking to plant features like a mesquite tree or trees that are pretty invasive, you might want to increase that distance. Here's another example here from a project with some existing plant material as well. So they've got an existing citrus tree. So their basins are designed all the way around to help supply extra water for that citrus tree. You can see in this picture, somebody who asked about using a survey, they've got some survey equipment out here. They're doing it that way. If you are familiar with that equipment and you want to do it yourself, you can. But they did not use the bunyip on this project. But you can see the finished result here. You can see the basins that are around the tree. So this is all meant to kind of help support the extra water demand that this citrus tree has. Some other things to keep in mind, slope. So this is how steep the sides of your basin or features are. We want to keep those slopes as naturalistic looking as possible. And so ideally you want to keep to a slope of 3 to 1 or 4 to 1, which means that for every foot you go up in elevation, you go at least 3 to 4 feet out. And if you need to do a steeper slope like 1 to 1 or 2 to 1, that's when you would use rock, like they've shown in this picture. And that allows you to make the sides a little bit steeper so you can get more water holding capacity without that soil collapsing on itself. This can be kind of a challenge, so make sure if you've got kind of like a narrow space here, you're keeping that in mind. You might not actually have 3 or 4 feet to go out. And so, in a narrow area like that, you may need to look at using rock mulch or something to stabilize the slopes. And just some other things to note, I mentioned in that one example there of utilizing this is kind of like going back to that stacking functions, but if you're going to be excavating material for some of your features, think about other ways to use that. So building up raised pathways using that soil is a really great solution because otherwise it can be kind of cost prohibitive to have to take that soil off site. So always keep an eye out for flooding, and this is part of your continual observation. Make sure that you're not creating effects that you didn't want to create by your features. Look for ponding water that's not draining within 36 hours. That can increase the potential for mosquitoes. Make sure you're not having any conflicts with infrastructure, foundations, utilities. And that your slopes, the sides of your basins and features are able to maintain their integrity. One thing here to mention too, so as a rule of thumb, it's good to keep your basins under 18 inches. 18 inches is pretty extreme. I like to keep my basins 12 inches or less. Beyond that, they can kind of become a trip or fall hazard. And so we don't want to, be creating unsafe spaces. So that's the general recommendation. I'm going to just kind of skip over some of these maintenance items. I'll leave it up, but generally, again, we're doing that continual observation, making sure things are functioning, cleaning things out when they need to be cleaned, making sure water is draining and moving the way it's supposed to. So, just keep up with all those features because these are not maintenance-free landscape features, but they can continue to improve and be useful over time if we take good care of them. So just keep an eye out for that. And then I'll leave this here. I've got, some time here. I'm happy to answer questions. But if you have anything that comes up later on, feel free to either reach out to myself or reach out to Charlie at Watershed Management Group. And that's all I've got. So thank you guys so much. I apologize for the technical issues. And thank you for sticking with me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kaylee. And thank you for everybody else for sticking around as well. I hope you learned a thing or two. Again, I definitely did. I'm like trying to redo my landscape pretty soon as well, so this was actually a really good one for me to attend too, even as the host. So yeah, and it's really cool to see just, how much water you can kind of contain within your own landscape and within that system as well. So again, like Kaylee said, please make sure to put any questions or comments in the chat as we're wrapping up. I did see a couple questions come in. If you do have any questions or think of them later on or we're not able to get to them, you can email Laura. So again, my name's Ginny, but I'm covering up for Laura tonight. So her email, and I'll put it in the chat, but it's Laura.Van Lith@Phoenix.gov. She is the main person who's coordinating this with Kaylee and with you all. But next week we'll be hosting the 4th class in this Hydrate Phoenix series, which is called Selecting Native Plants for Multiple Benefits. So yeah, please make sure to register for that class the same way you did for this one. And again, everything's going to be posted shortly after this class, either tomorrow or the next day on our YouTube channel for Phoenix. I'll put Laura's email right in the chat there if you have any other questions. I'm seeing a lot of praise in the chat, so thank you all so much for that. There are a couple questions. So from Dave, we had, do we use the roof's actual area or the area of floor that it covers? Using the roof area would seem to require knowing the roof's pitch, wouldn't it?
Yes, so correct. It would. So what you're calculating is just the floor area that it covers. So if you were to pull up that aerial image, all you need to do is measure the boundaries of the floor of the roof as you see it from the bird's eye view. Because water is only going to fall on the surface that way. We don't need to, it's not going to fall. There's not more water that's going to fall because of the pitch of the roof. So all you need is that basically the area of ground that roof covers. Great
Awesome
question.
and great question. From Jewel, we have this question. On the front of my house, I have no gutters, so water drops in the plants at the edge of the roof except for the driveway, wearing away without the gutter. In the back, I put up a leaky gutter system, so I've used galvanized 33-gallon cans to collect water and one true rain barrel that I can drain out a hose. So other than an electrical sump pump to drain the water from the trash cans, is there a passive way without drilling holes in the cans? So I think they're just
Um,
made, yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, so there may be some different like manual pumps that are available. I don't know if that's any more usable. Um, but what I would look for is to create a sealed um like penetration into your barrel. So if you buy a manufactured barrel, it will come with a what we call a bulkhead fitting. And it's a fitting that has a gasket on it so that when you screw it into the side of your basin, it creates a watertight seal, and then you can attach, whatever kind of plumbing fitting you'd like to put. And you can put a hose bib, you can put a ball valve, whatever you want. And so what I would do is look for a bulkhead fitting It can be a little tricky to find them at like Lowe's, Home Depot. They'll often have them, but not in a lot of sizes. So you may need to go to a plumbing supply store. But yeah, that's what I would look for. And then that way you can just put a hose bib on it and use it that way. Um, so if you're you may not know what a bulkhead fitting is. So if you find like go to a tank manufacturer, one that they include that with it, and then you can usually find the part information from that. Take that to the plumbing supply store, and they can help you find something. The other
Awesome.
place
Thank you. Oh, go
I
ahead.
was going to say too, the other place you can check it, it's it might be inconvenient drive for you, but Arizona Tank and Barrel and Apache Junction, they sell all those fittings and stuff. So that you might call them and they can help direct you to a better part.
Awesome. Yeah. Something I've learned in my job is just don't be afraid to ask questions, you know? So definitely that's similar for this, I think. So good. Like ask for help, ask for resources. There's one person that said, I'm wondering if people tend to have issues with HOAs trying to get this type of plan approved. Any tips on how to get your plan approved?
Yeah, so definitely have run into issues with HOAs. I'll say the HOAs the newer your HOA is, the more strict they'll be about it. That's been my experience. Um, Older HOAs, it tends to be a little bit easier. Mostly they'll be concerned with kind of aesthetic things, so they might not let you get away with the wood chip mulch, things like that, or a tank. They might have a problem with the tank. The newer HOAs, they tend to have more of a problem with drainage, and they don't want you to alter the drainage of your landscape like at all. So if that's the case, that can be really difficult to get around. And you might need to hire a surveyor to certify that your landscape drains properly, even after your landscape design. But that's only if you're in like a super brand new development. Otherwise, um, it tends to be okay. It's more of the aesthetic things than the drainage issues. And uh, so in any case, as long as your landscape um, overflows. So if you design it so that it overflows the same way that it did before your project started, then generally I haven't had a problem with those older HOAs. Um, yeah, sorry. I hope that was clear enough. It's just, I think you're in pretty good shape if you have an older HOA. They might just be concerned about the aesthetics. Newer ones are a little bit more of sticklers on the drainage, but you can get around it by having some professionals help you certify that you're following their restrictions.
Awesome, thank you. And then there was one from a little bit earlier. It might not apply to this, but this is the person's question. This question might be more for watershed restoration outside of your backyard, but are there any resources for using raw wool in watershed restoration?
That that is a question that is stretching my knowledge. Um, There's nothing that I know of that's coming to mind. I would assume that it would also be really great for like erosion control. So it may be in restoration. Like I could definitely see that application in restoration projects. Um, I think you would run into kind of similar problems sometimes people run into with wood chip mulch, which is like, and it ends up being an aesthetic thing. So if it were covered, like if you used as a layer underneath rock mulch, so it wasn't really visible, um, then it might have some utility. I don't know. The only other thing I would think of with wool, um, is that in general, because we don't get a lot of rain here, like things break down in our soil a lot slower. So if you were counting on it to break down, It might take longer than if you were using that in like, Seattle or something like that. So yeah, those are just some things that are coming off the top of my head, but I don't know of any specific instances where I've seen wool used for rainwater harvesting projects in like desert areas.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question and great ideas there too. Maybe try for the person who asked the question, maybe try reaching out to Charlie or someone else that's working
Yeah.
on watershed restoration. Maybe they might have a little bit more information about that. Um, but yeah, thank you so much. I think that was everything that people had. And like I said, again, feel free to send any more questions to either of these folks. So either Kaylee, who's here with us tonight, or Charlie, or to my colleague Lara as well. And